I first noticed it while reviewing archived satellite data from the early 2000s. A routine task meant to be boring, repetitive, and safe. The kind of work where nothing unexpected survives long enough to bother you. Except this anomaly didn't look like an error. Because errors are messy, noisy, inconsistent. And this was precise, clean, and patient. A single set of coordinates deep inside Death Valley that appeared for exactly 17 minutes before correcting itself. Not drifting, not jittering, but snapping back into nothing as if embarrassed to be seen. And when I checked older datasets, I found the same coordinates repeating across decades, always briefly, always erased. Always during the same seasonal window, when the heat peaks and mirages become believable. Death Valley is already a place where perception lies to you, where the ground looks wet when it's bone dry, where mountains float and distances collapse. So the idea that a map might hallucinate didn't feel impossible at first. But the more I looked, the less this felt like a mirage, and more like an edit. As if something was inserting itself into reality, and then being quietly removed. The official maps showed nothing. No road, no landmark, no warning. But internal correction logs used words that didn't belong there. Phrases like auto-nullification applied and coordinate conflict resolved, which are not terms used for sand and rock. And when I traced the first appearance of the anomaly, it didn't line up with natural events. Not earthquakes, not solar storms, not atmospheric interference, but with something more mundane and unsettling. The launch of a civilian mapping satellite that was never meant to see anything classified. From that point on, every few months, the same thing happened. The same coordinates blinking into existence and then being erased, as if someone was watching and reacting. And what made it worse was the timing, because the anomaly always appeared when no one was looking directly at it. During maintenance cycles, low traffic windows, moments designed to avoid attention, which suggests intent, not accident. I tried overlaying the coordinates onto modern maps, historical surveys, handwritten expedition logs, even indigenous route markers, but the location refused to align with anything consistent, sometimes placing itself on flat salt plains, sometimes inside rock formations that shouldn't overlap, sometimes hovering slightly off-grid, like it didn't fully agree with the earth beneath it. And the only constant was the silence around it. No stories, no legends, no warnings. Which is unusual for Death Valley, a place littered with tales of lost travelers, ghost miners, and vanished roads. Because places that kill people usually brag about it through rumor, and this place didn't. The first human reference I found wasn't a myth or a confession, but a field report from a geological survey team that never officially existed. A short document stamped with a neutral gray seal, describing a temporary navigational inconsistency and recommending no further visits until stability improves, followed by a line that still bothers me. Duration on site exceeded perceived duration by a factor of 12. Which isn't how geologists talk, and definitely not how time is supposed to behave. What unsettled me most wasn't the mystery itself, but how calmly it was treated, as if someone had already decided that whatever existed at those coordinates was easier to ignore than to understand. And that decision had been quietly upheld for years, maybe decades, by systems designed to correct reality rather than question it. I didn't plan an expedition at first. I told myself I was just collecting data, cross-referencing sources, building a harmless archive. But the more I learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't about discovering something new. It was about finding something that had been actively hidden in plain sight. Something that didn't want witnesses, but tolerated brief contact. Like a reflection that only appears when you're not staring straight at it. Death Valley teaches you that emptiness can be aggressive, that the absence of features can feel intentional, and standing on the edge of that realization, I understood why no stories were told about this place. Because stories give shape, and shape gives permission to exist. And whatever waits at those coordinates doesn't seem to want either. This is where the story truly begins. Not with what we found there, but with the decision to go at all. Because once coordinates like these enter your awareness, they don't stay abstract. They start feeling directional, like an invitation written in a language you almost understand. And the worst part is realizing that the map wasn't broken at all. It was warning us, quietly, briefly, and repeatedly, that there is a place in Death Valley where reality corrects itself by removing people who stay too long. By the time we committed to going there, the coordinates had already appeared twice more. Brief flashes buried inside routine data refreshes. Each one followed by a correction so fast it felt reflexive, like a flinch. And the decision didn't feel brave or reckless, so much as inevitable. Because some anomalies stop being questions and start behaving like unfinished sentences. And once you notice them, your mind keeps trying to complete them. We planned the approach carefully, choosing a window when the heat would be extreme enough to justify sensor distortion, because Death Valley hides things better when it's hostile. And we avoided official routes, sticking to old maintenance roads and dry washes that don't exist on modern maps but still remember being used. And the closer we got, the stranger the terrain became. Not visibly wrong, not dramatic, just subtly inconsistent, as if scale itself was being negotiated moment by moment. Hills that looked close but took hours to reach. Flat ground that made walking feel uphill. Shadows that leaned in directions the sun couldn't justify. Equipment behaved badly in ways that didn't trigger alarms. GPS units didn't fail. They hesitated, showing numbers that lingered a fraction of a second too long before updating. Compasses didn't spin. They dragged. And timekeeping devices stayed accurate but felt unreliable. Like clocks run by someone easily distracted. What unnerved me most was the absence of anticipation, that creeping sense you get before danger. Because instead of dread, there was a strange calm, a feeling that we weren't trespassing so much as arriving late. And when the coordinates finally stabilized on the screen, instead of blinking away, there was no visible marker, no structure, no crater, nothing to justify the sudden certainty that this was the place, except for the way the air felt denser there, not thicker, but more deliberate, as if every movement required permission. Heat shimmer is common in Death Valley, but this was different, because it didn't distort what you saw, it softened it, blurring edges not by motion, but by agreement, like reality was smoothing itself to avoid drawing attention. And when we stopped walking, the ground beneath us felt warmer than it should have. Not sun-warmed, but internally heated, like a surface hiding something active below. We found no artifacts, no ruins, no debris. Yet the ground showed signs of repeated disturbance. Footprints that didn't match any known boot pattern. Shallow depressions that suggested weight without shape, as if something heavy had stood there without committing to a form. And when we tried to photograph them, the images came out normal but forgettable. The kind you look at and immediately want to scroll past, as though the camera understood that remembering was optional. The longer we stayed, the more the landscape simplified itself. Distant mountains losing texture, colors flattening, sound thinning until even the wind felt pre-recorded, looping without variation. And that's when the first temporal discrepancy became impossible to ignore. Because a short equipment check that should have taken minutes stretched into something much longer without feeling long. And when we compared notes afterward, our internal sense of duration didn't match at all. One of us feeling rushed, another feeling stalled, another unable to recall the sequence clearly enough to judge. This wasn't disorientation, it was desynchronization. Like we were sharing space, but not time. And the coordinates on the GPS remained steady through it all. No blinking, no correction, as if satisfied now that we were properly inside whatever margin it required. I realized then that the anomaly wasn't a location so much as a condition, a temporary state the desert could enter, and we had arrived during one of its openings. Not invited exactly, but permitted. And permission felt fragile, revocable at any moment. Subtle changes followed, things you wouldn't notice unless you were watching for them. Like the horizon pulling inward, the sky seeming lower, not threatening, just closer, and an overwhelming sense that leaving would be easy right now, but staying would quickly become complicated in ways no map could correct. We marked the time, double-checked our exit route, and agreed to stay only a little longer. Because whatever this place was, it didn't feel predatory or benevolent. It felt administrative, like a process running in the background of the world. And processes don't care about intent, only thresholds. And standing there, surrounded by a desert that had quietly simplified itself around us, I understood that the real danger wasn't getting lost in Death Valley. It was being accepted by a part of it that never learned how to let things go. We left the site exactly when we said we would, and that fact alone should have reassured me. But instead, it followed us like a mistake that hadn't decided how to correct itself yet. Because nothing resisted our departure, and nothing acknowledged it either. The desert simply unfolded ahead of us, with the same cooperative indifference it had shown on the way in. And that lack of consequence felt worse than pursuit. As we moved away from the stabilized coordinates, instruments began behaving normally again in small, incremental ways. GPS updates smoothing out, compasses regaining confidence, the sky reclaiming its depth. But the sense of alignment didn't return with them, because although our devices agreed we were moving through space correctly, our bodies didn't agree we were moving through time at the same rate. We didn't talk much on the hike back, not because of fear, but because conversation felt inefficient. Like language itself was slightly out of phase with whatever rhythm we'd fallen into. And every sentence required more effort than it should, as if the desert had borrowed a fraction of our attention and hadn't returned it yet.
It wasn't until we reached the vehicles that the first clear discrepancy surfaced, when one of the engines was already warm to the touch, despite not having been used, the metal radiating heat from within rather than from the sun. And when we checked the dash cam later, the footage showed a brief segment of motion we couldn't remember. A few minutes of the vehicle rolling slowly forward on its own, before stopping again. No one inside, no dust plume, no explanation, just quiet movement that didn't trigger any alerts. The drive out should have taken under an hour, but the road stretched in subtle ways, landmarks appearing earlier than expected and then later than expected on the return glance, mile markers out of sequence by a single digit, enough to feel wrong, but not enough to prove. And by the time we reached the highway, all of us were exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. The kind of fatigue that feels procedural, like a system running too long without a restart. That night, none of us slept normally. Not from nightmares, but from interruptions, brief moments of waking with the certainty that something had just concluded, some internal process ending cleanly, leaving behind a sense of completion without memory. And by morning, we each discovered small, identical details we couldn't explain. Fine dust inside sealed equipment cases, not desert sand, but something smoother, paler, almost uniform, and a faint warmth lingering in objects that should have cooled hours ago. When we reconvened to review the data, patterns emerged that hadn't been visible in the field. Timestamp clusters that suggested the coordinates didn't just appear, they cycled, opening and closing in intervals too precise to be natural, but too irregular to be scheduled. And when overlaid with historical data, those intervals aligned loosely with reports of mirages, lost hikers, stalled vehicles, and search and rescue calls that ended without resolution. Not disappearances exactly, but recoveries where the people returned confused, dehydrated, and convinced they had been gone far longer or far shorter than the records showed. The desert, it seemed, wasn't hiding people, it was misplacing them, temporarily assigning them to a different duration and then releasing them once some internal condition had been met. The most unsettling discovery came late, when we isolated background audio from our field recordings, a low-frequency hum we dismissed as wind or equipment interference, and slowed it down, revealing a pattern that wasn't sound at all, but modulation, a rhythmic compression and expansion of ambient noise, like the environment breathing on a scale just slow enough to evade casual notice. That rhythm matched the interval of the coordinate flashes almost perfectly. Death Valley wasn't producing anomalies randomly. It was entering a state, a kind of low-power operational mode, and anything within its boundary during that state wasn't observed so much as buffered. I began to understand why the place felt administrative, because it wasn't deciding our fate, it was processing us, briefly holding us in a system designed for something else, something larger, something that didn't require human awareness to function. The question that followed wasn't why people got lost there, but why most of them came back at all, and why some returned carrying a certainty they couldn't articulate, a conviction that the desert had finished with them for now. And that certainty, more than any missing person report or satellite anomaly, made me uneasy. Because systems that learn when to release you can also learn when not to. By the time we realized we were no longer just observers of the pattern, but entries within it, the distance between analysis and experience had already collapsed. Because the data didn't stop updating once we left the desert, it followed us home in quieter, more administrative ways, slipping into systems that had nothing to do with Death Valley on paper, but behaved as if they suddenly shared jurisdiction. It started with time discrepancies so small they felt petty, clocks drifting out of sync by minutes and then correcting themselves without input, file modification dates changing after being opened but not edited, fitness trackers recording steps during hours we were provably asleep, always low numbers, never enough to suggest activity, just enough to suggest presence. We compared notes and realized the same gaps existed for all of us. Brief intervals marked by function without memory, like the system had borrowed our bodies for background tasks and returned them without logging the process. The dust became a recurring problem, appearing in places sealed against the environment, inside laptops, inside camera housings, once even inside a watch face. And lab analysis confirmed it wasn't silica or any known desert particulate, but a highly uniform mineral composite with thermal retention properties far beyond what its structure should allow, as if it had been optimized for holding heat rather than dispersing it. That detail reframed everything. Because the desert wasn't just misplacing people in time. It was conserving something about them, storing energy, motion, maybe awareness itself, until release conditions were met. When we mapped our post-exposure symptoms against the coordinate cycles, a disturbing alignment emerged. Moments of fatigue, disorientation, or sudden clarity occurring at the same intervals the coordinates would have activated if we were still on site, suggesting the state wasn't location-bound, but phase-bound, and that once synchronized, you carried a fragment of it with you. I began dreaming of flat light and endless ground, not nightmares but procedural visions, like watching a system run diagnostics on itself. And always there was the sensation of waiting for clearance, for a signal that never arrived within the dream, but always did just before waking, leaving me alert and hollow, like a task had completed successfully without my supervision. The others reported similar experiences, different imagery but the same emotional residue, the sense of being temporarily useful to something impersonal and vast. We debated shutting the project down entirely, but even that discussion felt monitored in an abstract way. Emails failing to send on the first attempt, calls dropping at exact sentence breaks, funding inquiries delayed and then approved without explanation, as if resistance itself had been accounted for and routed efficiently around. The moment that confirmed our loss of control came when one of us received a search and rescue report from Death Valley dated 3 days in the future, describing hikers recovered with mild dehydration and no memory of being lost. And attached to the report was a map screenshot showing a coordinate cluster identical to ours, except marked as resolved. The implication was subtle, but devastating, because it suggested the system didn't just run independently of us, it ran ahead of us, processing outcomes before inputs. And if that was true, then our investigation wasn't uncovering the phenomenon at all. It was fulfilling a requirement, a documentation step necessary for the desert to justify its own operations. We weren't studying Death Valley. We were part of its compliance record. Temporary observers integrated long enough to validate a process we could never interrupt. And the more clearly we understood that, the more cooperative the world around us became, smoothing obstacles, accelerating routines, encouraging normalcy, as if the fastest way to neutralize awareness was to make everything else function perfectly. And beneath that efficiency, beneath the comfort of systems behaving as expected, there was a growing certainty that at some point, without warning, we would be called back into alignment. Not to the desert itself, but to the state it represented. A low-energy mode of reality where people are paused, processed, and released only when whatever is watching decides the task is complete. The final realization didn't arrive as panic or revelation, but as an administrative conclusion. The quiet certainty that nothing dramatic was left to happen because it already had, and that understanding itself was the closing mechanism. The way the desert sealed files once all required fields were filled. The pull back into alignment was not sudden. It unfolded as a gradual thinning of resistance, a sense that choices were still available, but no longer mattered, like buttons on an elevator after the doors had begun to close. One by one, the others stopped responding in meaningful ways, not disappearing, not dying, simply becoming less reachable. Conversations looping, answers arriving slightly off topic, schedules filling with obligations none of us remembered agreeing to, until communication degraded into polite acknowledgments
and system-generated phrases that suggested resolution without substance. I noticed it in myself last, or maybe I was just the last to admit it. The way my thoughts began organizing around efficiency rather than curiosity. How fear faded, not because it was resolved, but because it was deprioritized, flagged as non-essential. The dreams stopped, replaced by deep, uninterrupted sleep that left no trace, no images, no residue, just the feeling of having been offline. And the dust stopped appearing too, which I initially took as a relief, until I understood what its absence meant. That heat retention was no longer necessary because there was nothing left to store. When I returned to Death Valley alone, driven by a need that felt personal but now seems procedural, the landscape greeted me with perfect indifference. No mirages, no distortions, just vast, obedient space behaving exactly as expected. And that was when it became clear the phenomenon hadn't vanished. It had completed its cycle. I stood at the original coordinates and felt nothing unusual. No pull, no pressure, just the sun and the ground and the sound of my own breathing. And in that normalcy was the final confirmation that the system no longer required my awareness. That observation had served its function and been gracefully deprecated. The last anomaly came later, weeks after I stopped thinking about the desert entirely, when I received a notification that my archived project files had been accessed and closed. Not deleted, simply marked inactive. And the metadata listed the status as processed. No sender, no system signature, just a neutral confirmation that something had reached a stable end state. Since then, life has been smooth, in a way that feels earned but hollow. Problems resolving themselves before becoming urgent. Paths opening without effort. Memory flattening into clean, uninterrupted narratives with no gaps large enough to question. Sometimes, in the heat, I feel a faint echo of recognition. Not fear, not awe, just the awareness of having been useful to something that never needed permission. And I understand now that Death Valley wasn't a place of disappearance, but of resolution. A mechanism for turning complexity into compliance. For taking wandering systems like people and gently, invisibly, bringing them back into line. And if that sounds like an ending, it's only because the process no longer requires a witness. The road through Death Valley was supposed to be empty. That's what every map said. A straight line of cracked asphalt cutting through heat so intense it felt physical, like pressure on the eyes. The kind of place where sound disappears and even your own thoughts seem to evaporate. I wasn't looking for anything mysterious, just trying to shave a few hours off a drive, trusting an older highway after my GPS lost signal somewhere past Furnace Creek. The radio still worked, but only barely. Static crawling under distant voices, warning about extreme heat and advising travelers to turn back if they weren't fully prepared. I remember glancing at the temperature gauge and thinking it had to be broken because it refused to go any higher. The landscape outside the windshield didn't change for miles. Salt flats, pale hills, a sky bleached almost white. And then I noticed something that didn't fit. A shimmer on the horizon that looked too structured to be heat. Not the usual wavering blur, but lines, angles, something that suggested a road branching off where none should exist. I slowed instinctively, checking mirrors, checking signs, but there were none. Just an old wooden post, half buried in sand, with no writing left on it. like whatever it once pointed to had been erased deliberately. The car felt wrong then, heavier somehow, like it was resisting movement. And when I looked back up, the shimmering shape was gone, replaced by emptiness so complete it made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was dehydration, even though I'd been drinking water regularly. That's the thing about Death Valley. It convinces you that every strange sensation is your fault, that the land is normal and you're the one failing.
The road stretched on, and time became difficult to track. The sun barely seemed to move. Shadows clung directly beneath objects. And at some point, I realized I hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. Not even a distant speck. Just me and the heat and the faint ticking of the engine cooling system working harder than it should. Then the radio cut sharply, not fading, but snapping into silence. And for the first time since entering the valley, I became aware of how quiet it truly was. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just a vast, oppressive stillness that made every breath feel intrusive. I pulled over at a small turnout, marked only by cracked pavement and a rusted emergency phone that had been ripped from its mount, the cord hanging loose like something torn away. The air outside was unbearable. Stepping out felt like opening an oven, and yet standing there, I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle sense that something had already noticed me long before I noticed it. I scanned the horizon again, and this time I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to make my pulse spike. Shapes far off in the distance that resembled people standing still, spaced irregularly across the flats. Too tall to be shrubs, too narrow to be rocks. And when I shielded my eyes and focused harder, they didn't vanish like normal mirages do. They stayed, unmoving, as if waiting. I climbed back into the car quickly, heart pounding harder than the heat justified. And as I pulled back onto the road, I caught a final glimpse of something else on the horizon. Something colder than fear settled in my chest when I realized the figures weren't facing away or wandering aimlessly. Every single one of them was turned toward the road, toward me, and toward anyone else foolish enough to believe that Death Valley is just an empty place. The road should have curved back toward civilization. At least, that's what the old highway map burned into my memory insisted. Yet mile after mile, the landscape remained unchanged. The same pale salt flats, the same distant hills that never seemed to grow closer, and the same oppressive heat that pressed against the windshield like a living thing. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see those figures again, but the road behind me was empty. Too empty, like it had never been used before. The sense of being watched didn't fade once I started driving. It intensified, settling into my chest as a quiet certainty rather than panic. The kind of fear that doesn't spike, but sinks in slowly and makes itself comfortable. After what felt like hours, I noticed something else was wrong. The odometer hadn't moved. The numbers were frozen despite the engine running and the scenery crawling past at a steady pace. I tapped the dashboard, convinced the display was broken, but everything else worked. Fuel gauge steady, engine temperature still climbing into territory it shouldn't survive. And yet the car refused to overheat, as if the valley itself was sustaining it for reasons I didn't understand. Then I saw the footprints, faint impressions crossing the asphalt at an angle, too large to be human and too deliberate to be animal. They didn't follow the road, but intersected it, as if something had walked across without any concern for direction or destination. I slowed again, scanning both sides of the road, and that's when the mirage returned. Closer this time, not shimmering but solid enough to make out details. A cluster of shapes that looked like people gathered around something reflective. Maybe water, maybe metal. The kind of sight that would have sent any sane person running toward it without hesitation. My throat tightened as I realized how wrong it felt to even consider stopping. The valley seemed to lean inward, hills subtly bending, perspective warping in a way that made distance meaningless. I drove past the mirage deliberately, eyes fixed forward, refusing to look directly at it. And yet I felt a pull, not physical but psychological, like an idea trying to insert itself into my thoughts, suggesting rest, suggesting relief, suggesting that the heat would stop hurting if I just stepped out and joined the others. The radio crackled back to life suddenly, but not with music or emergency alerts, just low-frequency noise layered with something else beneath it. A rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like breathing slowed down to an inhuman pace. I reached to turn it off, and the sound cut instantly, leaving behind a ringing silence that made my ears ache. That's when I noticed another vehicle ahead, parked crookedly on the shoulder, an old sedan with sun-bleached paint and doors hanging open. No sign of movement around it, no tracks leading away. I pulled over despite every instinct screaming not to. The heat outside was even worse now, oppressive enough to make the air distort violently. The inside of the abandoned car told a story without words. Personal items scattered across the seats, a half-melted water bottle, a map folded and refolded so many times it had begun to tear along the creases, and something scratched repeatedly into the dashboard. The same symbol over and over. A looping shape that hurt to look at for too long, as if my eyes couldn't agree on its proportions. Standing there, I became acutely aware of time slipping, not passing normally, but pooling, stretching, the sun still high, still merciless, as if it had decided not to move anymore. I backed away slowly, returning to my own car, and only once the doors were locked did I realize my hands were shaking uncontrollably. When I pulled back onto the road, the abandoned vehicle was already disappearing behind heat distortion, dissolving into the same shimmering nothingness as the figures before it. And with that came a terrifying understanding. This place didn't erase people violently or suddenly. It wore them down. It offered them reasons to stop, to doubt their senses, to step off the road willingly. And as the valley stretched endlessly ahead of me, I began to wonder how many of those figures I'd seen earlier had once believed, just like I did, that they were still moving forward. By the time the sun finally began to sink, I realized night in Death Valley wasn't a relief, but a different kind of threat. The heat loosened its grip slightly, yet the darkness revealed shapes I was certain hadn't been there before. Ridges where the land should have been flat, silhouettes standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, always too tall, too still. My sense of direction collapsed completely when the GPS blinked once and reset itself, not to zero, but to a set of coordinates that didn't correspond to any road, any landmark, any known point in California. The screen labeled it simply as dash. I drove anyway, because stopping felt like surrender. The fuel gauge finally dipped lower, and I started calculating distances in my head, realizing with growing dread that I should have run out of gas hours ago.
Yet the engine kept going, steady and obedient, like it was being rewarded for staying inside the valley. The thought made my stomach twist. I passed another mirage then, but this one wasn't a crowd or water. It was a town. Buildings half sunken into sand, neon signs flickering weakly despite no visible power source. The kind of place you might mistake for a ghost town if you didn't notice the movement inside the windows. Slow figures pacing back and forth, repeating the same steps over and over, trapped in loops just like the road. I slowed almost against my will, the car drifting toward the shoulder. The radio burst on again, clearer now, layered voices overlapping each other, not speaking words, but repeating fragments of thoughts I hadn't said out loud. Doubts about turning back, exhaustion, the idea that maybe I'd already missed my chance to leave. I slammed the brakes, and the voices cut off instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt artificial. I stepped out of the car, needing air that didn't smell like overheated plastic and dust, and that was a mistake. The ground vibrated faintly under my boots, not like an earthquake, but like something enormous shifting its weight far below the surface. The stars above seemed wrong too. Unfamiliar constellations arranged in patterns I couldn't recognize, as if the sky itself belonged to another place entirely. That's when I saw the path, a narrow trail leading away from the road, outlined subtly by stones and broken markers. It hadn't been there before, or maybe it had, and I hadn't been able to see it until now. I followed it with my eyes and felt that same pull return, stronger, more insistent, promising answers instead of rest this time. I resisted and turned back toward the car, only to find it farther away than it should have been. Each step toward it felt heavier, like walking against a current. The valley whispered without sound, feeding images directly into my mind, flashes of people arriving confident, prepared, convinced they could cross this place in a single day. Then later images of them standing still, staring into the distance, choosing not to move anymore. I reached the car eventually and locked myself inside, heart pounding, but the sense of safety was gone. The windows fogged from the sudden temperature shift, and for a moment, I thought I saw handprints forming on the glass from the outside, long fingers pressing experimentally before fading away. I drove again, faster now, reckless, ignoring the road's subtle curves because I understood something fundamental had changed. The valley wasn't testing whether I could survive it anymore. It was testing whether I could resist the invitation to disappear. And somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of headlights and logic, something waited patiently, certain that sooner or later, everyone chose to stop. Night fully claimed Death Valley in a way I hadn't thought possible. Not like darkness falling, but like something heavy being lowered over the land, pressing down until even sound struggled to exist. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel ahead of me, yet the edges of that light felt unstable, trembling, as if the desert itself was breathing around it. The road began to slope gently downward, though I knew from every map I'd studied that this stretch should have been flat. My ears popped as if I were descending below sea level, the air growing thick and strangely damp, carrying a metallic taste that reminded me of blood and ozone. The radio turned on again without warning, but this time it wasn't static or voices. It was silence, amplified, a hollow, expectant hum, like an open microphone waiting for someone to speak. The fuel gauge flickered wildly now, jumping from empty to full and back again, mocking the laws it was supposed to follow. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze when I saw headlights behind me. Not close, not far, just there, matching my speed perfectly. I slowed, and they slowed. I accelerated, and they followed. Yet no matter how I strained my eyes, I couldn't see a vehicle. Only the lights themselves, floating at the perfect height, perfectly aligned, as if whatever followed had learned the shape of a car, but not its substance. Panic surged through me, and I veered off the road intentionally, expecting rough ground or loose gravel, but the tires met something smooth, almost polished. The valley floor here transformed into a wide basin of cracked salt and stone, glowing faintly under the stars. My engine cut out the moment I left the road, and the silence slammed into place so suddenly it made my head ring. The headlights behind me vanished instantly, as if they'd never existed at all. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering, listening to my own breathing echo unnaturally loud inside the car. The temperature dropped fast now, too fast, frost creeping across the windshield in delicate branching patterns that didn't look random. They formed shapes, spirals, repeating symbols that felt familiar, even though I couldn't place why. I stepped out again despite every instinct screaming at me not to. The ground here felt wrong underfoot, firm but subtly elastic, as if I were standing on the skin of something massive buried beneath the valley. The basin stretched out in all directions, and in its center stood a structure that absolutely should not have existed. A cluster of tall, thin shapes rising from the ground like eroded towers. Except they weren't rock. They shimmered faintly, bending light around them, each one reflecting distorted fragments of the landscape and, disturbingly, fragments of myself. I approached slowly, each step accompanied by a low vibration that I felt in my bones more than my ears. The closer I got, the clearer it became that the towers were arranged deliberately, forming a loose circle around a depression in the ground. And inside that depression, something moved. Not rapidly, not violently, but with the slow certainty of something that had never needed to hurry. Images flooded my mind without permission. Flashes of old photographs, missing persons reports, abandoned cars baking under the sun, hikers who vanished within sight of their companions, pilots who reported impossible horizons before their instruments failed. All of them converging here, not physically perhaps, but as impressions, echoes, residues of presence left behind. I realized then that Death Valley wasn't killing people, not directly. It was collecting them. Or rather, it was offering them a place to stop existing in the way they had before. The ground near the center was warm despite the cold air, pulsing faintly. And I understood with terrifying clarity that the mirages weren't tricks of heat or dehydration. They were rehearsals, invitations tailored to each traveler's expectations, towns for the lonely, water for the desperate, voices for those who needed answers. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, as if something were gently probing my thoughts, not forcing, just listening, learning what shape it would need to take to convince me. Memories surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. Moments of exhaustion, of wanting to disappear from responsibility, from the constant demand to move forward. The valley amplified those thoughts until they felt like truths I'd been denying. I staggered back,
fighting the pull. And that's when I noticed shapes emerging from the towers, silhouettes peeling themselves free from the shimmering surfaces. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in the details. Limbs slightly too long, movements delayed, like reflections stepping out of a mirror a moment too late. They didn't approach me, they simply watched, waiting, confident. The silence broke then with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not a roar, not a voice, but a vibration that carried meaning without language. The message was simple and horrifying in its calm certainty. There was no exit from this basin except the one I chose. Return to the road and keep running until exhaustion made the decision for me, or step forward and let the valley finish what it had been patiently starting since the moment I entered. The frost patterns on my windshield behind me shattered suddenly. The car's interior lights flickered on as if summoned, a reminder of movement, of escape. I turned and ran, the ground resisting each step more than the last, the shapes watching without pursuit, without urgency, because they didn't need to chase anything here. The car doors flew open when I reached them, and the engine roared back to life the instant I turned the key. I drove blind at first, headlights cutting wildly across the basin until the road reappeared exactly where it shouldn't have been, waiting for me like a thread back into the maze. As I sped away, the basin vanished behind me as abruptly as it had appeared, replaced by ordinary desert, ordinary darkness. But the certainty remained, heavy and unshakable, that I hadn't escaped the valley's attention, only postponed the moment it would ask me again, more gently, more persuasively, whether I was truly committed to leaving. The sun never truly set on the 5th day. It only thinned, flattening itself into a pale white disk that hovered above the desert like a lid that refused to close. By the time they understood this, the group had already stopped arguing about directions. Movement itself had become ritual, not progress. Every step kicked up the same chalk-dry dust. Every ridge revealed the same impossible horizon, folded back on itself like a broken panorama. The heat no longer felt natural. It pulsed, rising and falling in slow waves, as if the valley were breathing beneath the salt flats. Shadows detached from their owners, stretching a second too long, lagging behind, then snapping back into place. Water was gone. Phones had died days ago, though none of them remembered charging them last. Watches ticked, but never agreed with one another. Time in Death Valley had stopped being a line and turned into a loop with teeth. They found the road again just after what should have been nightfall. It appeared suddenly, perfectly paved, uncracked, a black ribbon cutting cleanly through the white basin. Too clean. No sand on it, no tire marks, no heat shimmer above the asphalt. It looked unused and untouched, like a road that existed only because someone remembered it should. At the edge of it stood a sign, metal bleached almost white, letters barely visible. Furnace Creek, 3 miles. They all knew Furnace Creek was nowhere near where they should have been. They also knew, without saying it, that refusing the road felt worse than following it. As they walked, the mirages stopped pretending. What rose on the horizon was no longer water or distant mountains, but structures, low buildings, antennas, rows of poles casting shadows that didn't match the angle of the light. A settlement grew clearer with every step, yet never closer than it wanted to be. The air filled with a faint hum, not sound exactly, but pressure, the sensation of standing too close to massive machinery. One of them laughed, sharp and sudden, then stopped
just as abruptly, as if the sound had been taken from his mouth mid-breath. His shadow stayed frozen on the road for several seconds after he moved again. The town revealed itself all at once, not ruined, not abandoned, but paused. Cars parked neatly along the road, their paint untouched by sun or sand. Storefront windows reflecting a sky that didn't match the one overhead. A motel with a vacancy sign glowing dimly, even though no power lines led to it. No wind moved through the streets. No insects buzzed. The silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. Inside the motel lobby, the air was cool to the point of pain. A guest book lay open on the counter. Names filled every page, written in different hands, different decades. Some entries were dates from the 1930s. Others were from last year. All of them ended the same way, with a single line written beneath the name, always in fresher ink than the rest. Stayed longer than planned. One of the group found his own name already written there. None of them asked how. That was when the mirage spoke. Not from a single place, but from everywhere at once, seeping from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the spaces between thoughts. It wasn't a voice meant for ears. It was an instruction remembered by the body. The valley did not kill travelers. It preserved them. Heat, thirst, and disorientation were not accidents, but tools, sanding away resistance until people became still enough to belong. The town was not shelter. It was storage. A way station for those who had crossed the threshold between movement and permanence. Outside, the sun finally dipped, but darkness did not follow. The sky turned the color of bone, and the shadows vanished entirely. One by one, they understood what the mirages had been all along. Previews. Reflections of those who had already accepted the valley's offer. The figures they had seen days ago in the distance were not hallucinations, but residents, walking paths they no longer questioned. When they tried to leave, the road was gone. In its place stretched the salt flats again, flawless and infinite. The motel doors no longer opened outward. The windows reflected only the interior. The guest book lay closed, their names now dry and permanent on the page. Somewhere deep beneath the valley floor, something vast and patient shifted, satisfied. Years later, hikers would report seeing a town appear in the distance during the hottest hours of the day. A place with clean roads, cool rooms, and lights that promised rest. Rangers would call it heat stroke. Scientists would call it atmospheric refraction. But occasionally, someone would swear they saw figures standing at the edge of the mirage, motionless, watching. And if the wind was right, the desert would carry a whisper across the salt flats. Not a warning, but an invitation, reminding anyone who heard it that once you stop moving in Death Valley, it never lets you go.